And we're back in the car on a Friday, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your early Friday evening here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Well, I apologize in advance. It's going to be another kind of remembrance and another somewhat somber episode. Hopefully not too somber. But with the passing of Robert Redford, most of the principals in my two favorite sports movies ever, which would be Chariots of Fire 1 and The Natural 2, many of the principals have passed. And in particular, the leads. Now, Robert Redford made it to 89. God bless, God rest his soul. You rarely see someone who is praised by just about everyone they met, especially in a crazy business like the movie business. But the lead actors in Chariots of Fire, which, as I say, is not only my favorite sports movie, it's my favorite movie of all time, period. And if you don't know the movie, it was a four-time Oscar winner. It won Oscars for Best Picture in the year of Raiders of the Lost Ark, Warren Beatty's Reds, On Golden Pond. Pretty good year for movies. But the two lead actors, it's based on a true story of the 1924 Olympics, more or less. And the lead actors are Ben Cross, who plays a Jewish track star named Harold Abrahams, and Ian Charleson, who plays a Scottish track star named Eric Liddell. They're basically rivals under the same flag. And what makes that movie unique is it has a two protagonist structure. There's no villain, and it's a two protagonist structure. The movie follows both Ben Cross's Harold Abrahams and Ian Charleson's Eric Liddell more or less concurrently, and I feel like Ben Cross has slightly more screen time than Ian Charleson, but just ever so slightly. It might be something like 55 to 45 as far as percentage. But Ben Cross passed away a little over 5 years ago. He was 72. He lived a full life and had an incredible, varied career on the stage and in movies. If you saw the Star Trek reboot, he plays Spock's father, Sarek. I thought he was beautifully cast. He was with Sean Connery and Richard Gere and Julia Ormond in the King Arthur, Knights of the Round Table, Lancelot movie, First Night, which the best thing about that movie, honestly, is Jerry Goldsmith's fantastic orchestral score. But Ben Cross kind of spanned the generations, and when you look at the scope of his career, he was probably just a hair's breadth shy of getting knighted. That's how well respected he was across the pond. So he lived a full life, but his co-star in Chariots of Fire, Ian Charleson, was only 40. Ian Charleson died in 1990. He was 40 years old. He was born, I think, in 1949, but he hadn't turned 41 yet. I'm not 100% on that, but he died of AIDS. Quite tragic that such a young man, he kind of kept the illness hidden, and many people didn't know that he was sick, and before you knew it, he was gone. And there's one other member of the cast of Chariots of Fire who also died way before his time, also of AIDS, Brad Davis. Brad Davis was somebody who looked like he was going to be a superstar. He starred in the multiple Oscar-nominated, I think it might have won a couple of awards, Midnight Express. Sir Alan Parker, speaking of people who've been knighted, Sir Alan Parker's just vicious, brutal, harrowing true story of Billy Hayes, who was Massapequa native, who got caught with hash in Turkey and spent 6 years in just a horrendous Turkish prison, where they treated him worse because he was an American, like that kind of thing. There was no diplomatic immunity a la Lethal Weapon 2 11 years later. But Brad Davis, fantastic actor. He was nominated for Best Actor. I think it was Jon Voight for Coming Home, if I'm not mistaken, that year for Best Actor. But Brad Davis was a wonderful actor. He did a kind of underrated war movie, which many people who know war movies would have in their top 10, maybe even top 5, called A Rumor of War. And in Chariots of Fire, he plays a character that is supposed to be like The Ugly American, because Chariots of Fire is a movie. It was funded with British money. It was a famous I keep all these people who were knighted. Sir David Putnam, who ran Columbia Pictures for a time after Chariots of Fire. But it is a movie that takes the perspective of the British track athletes. And the American track athletes, the big hitters on the American side, are played by someone who's still with us, Dennis Christopher, as a real-life 1920 Olympic 100-meter gold medalist, Charles Paddock. And Brad Davis, who is coming off the movies I mentioned, and it's a supporting role in Chariots of Fire, but he plays Jackson Schultz, who was also a top-level sprinter in the 100, the 200. I think he was also a high jumper. But the character that Brad Davis plays is not the ugly American. He is very sympathetic. He's somebody who respects his fellow athletes, and he respects Eric Liddell in particular because, and this is one reason why the film is so memorable, it's a movie that's about religion without being about religion in the way that you would expect, because both men run for their religion just in entirely different ways. And what I mean is, Ben Cross's Harold Abrahams is Jewish by birth, but he is not religious. Like, he wasn't bar mitzvahed. It doesn't appear, he may never have set foot in temple, but he is Jewish, and he feels as if people treat him differently, even though he comes from money. His dad was very well off and did well for himself, and the rest of the family, his uncle's a doctor, whatever. But he feels that people talk down to him and treat him as less than he is simply by virtue of what religion he was born into. And it motivates him. He uses it as a weapon. That's how he describes it. To just basically give the double middle finger salute to the establishment. He sees a victory as thumbing his nose at the system and the people who would dismiss him. And that's just how he rolls. He's a shameless self-promoter. He would have been a social media star if it had been later, because he's the guy, he's writing blind items and placing them in newspapers using his connections and his money, and nobody knows that he's writing about himself. Great stuff. Ian Charleson's Eric Liddell is a missionary, and his life's work appears to be converting as many people to his version of religion as he can. Now, normally I would be staunchly opposed to that. I think that's not good, because there, especially 100 years ago, there was the imperialist angle, like it's all negative, but he is so likable and he is so genuine. He is such a genuinely kind and decent person. Whereas Ben Cross's Harold Abrahams, he's got a real hard edge. He is less likable in the movie than Ian Charleson's Eric Liddell. When I mentioned, though, about Brad Davis as Jackson Schultz and the way that he communicates and empathizes with Eric Liddell's struggle, which is that the semifinal heat of the 100 meters, where he might end up in the finals against his countryman, his stablemate, his rival under the same flag, Harold Abrahams. That heat is on a Sunday, which in his religion, that's the Sabbath. And he struggles with the decision, but he doesn't really struggle. He knows he can't run on Sunday. He can't, because it goes against everything that he has stood for his whole life. And if he's the kind of person, if he's really going to be a missionary, if he's actually going to try to spread the word of God to others, he must honor it. He can't just be a paper tiger. It's the real thing for him. And when he stands up literally to the King of England, he, in the nicest way possible, tells the guy to fuck off. There is that notion of both Abrahams and Liddell refusing to conform, doing their own thing, following their better angels. I'm not going to play ball. Well, isn't this the time to put country first? No, it's not. And Harold Abrahams, in his own way, is not putting country first. He's putting himself first. He's putting his last name first. I want everybody to know. So, Brad Davis is Jackson Schultz. There is a moment after Eric Liddell has told off the ruling class and the British authority figures, and then they figure out a kind of strange compromise, where one of the other characters, a lord, based on a real guy, Lord Burghley, but in the world of the movie, it's his name is Lord Andrew Lindsay. And Lindsay is a high jumper and also I'm sorry, no, he's a hurdler. What am I talking about? He's a hurdler. And he comes up with a solution because he already won a medal in the hurdles, the high hurdles. He bronzed earlier in the Olympics, and he was supposed to run the 400 meter. And he basically says, we know it's not Eric's necessarily his best event, but I've already got my medal. Can he take my place in the 400s? And so Little stands up, is willing to punt the entire Olympics, and then a kind of deus ex machina, a last minute save from Lord Andrew Lindsay. He's able to compete in the Olympics. And after that scene, Eric Little and Jackson Schultz have a moment at this gala, whatever they're doing. It's the same kind of shit that they would do now where they're celebrating and the Olympics aren't even over yet. But basically, the two guys come to a kind of almost an understanding with each other. And we get the idea that Jackson Schultz is also saying, fuck country. I want Eric Little to win a gold because he got screwed over here. They tried to push this guy into doing something he didn't want to do. And look what happened. He ended up getting to have his cake and eat it too. And everybody ended up looking great, but especially the guy who said, my faith is more important than a race. And if I tell you that, that should be good enough for you. So the sad thing is that Brad Davis was very young when he passed. I think he was only 41. He died in 1991. He also died of AIDS. We think, when I say we, the conventional wisdom is that they think he contracted it sometime in the mid-'80s. He had been an intravenous drug user and had some really rough times. And I actually read the autobiography by his wife, Susan. I don't remember the name of the book, but what a harrowing read. I mean, he really suffered. And I assume that Ian Charleson suffered terribly before he passed. And there's a moment in Chariots of Fire, which is a beautiful moment. And it's a great moment 40 years ago, 45 years ago, almost, or 44 years ago when the movie came out. But for someone like me, who is such an enormous fan of this film, it hits different now. Now it hurts. Because there's a moment, and this isn't really much of a spoiler, where Ben Cross's Harold Abrahams has won gold medal. And Brad Davis's Jackson Schultz, who has just been defeated, comes over to congratulate him. He's a good sport. And Ian Charleson's Eric Little also comes over. And there is a beautiful shot. It's framed so perfectly. And this is a movie that's gorgeous. The cinematography is just beyond spectacular. The way they set the time period is such an incredibly detailed piece of work. But to see those three guys in the frame, and it's really sad. One of them lived a good life, a long life, 72, got about as much out of life as you can in Ben Cross. But Ian Charleson at 40 and Brad Davis at 41, and the way they went, it's just really sad. And you could say tragic to lose someone that young. Man, I'm 10 years older than Ian Charleson and Brad Davis were when they passed. And when I think of The Natural, there are a lot of the cast, unfortunately, is gone. The older actors. Wilford Brimley passed, I think, about 3 or 4 years ago. Robert Prosky passed many years ago. He played the judge in that movie. Richard Farnsworth, tremendous actor. I think he's been gone about 15 years. I want to say Farnsworth died in 2010. It's the way of life. And when a movie hits you as deeply as those two films hit me, I mean, I was the kind of person, even as a kid, that before the internet, I was looking up things. I was checking out books to see what other information I could glean about certain actors or actresses or filmmakers. I was just somebody who was really interested. And Roy Hobbs is, to me, one of the greatest characters in all of cinema. Like, he's top 10. And there's only one movie. It's not like Indiana Jones, who might be the greatest single character ever. I mean, he's certainly in the top 3 as far as I'm concerned. But Robert Redford as Roy Hobbs, like, that's the movie, that's the performance. And that's a film that I've probably seen start to finish at least 20 times. Dad took me to the movies I was 10 years old. He took me the opening weekend, May of 1984. It came out, I think, just before Ghostbusters. It came out before Beverly Hills Cop, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, Star Trek, The Search for Spock, The Last Starfighter, Karate Kid, Gremlins. That is a big movie summer of 84. But I saw The Natural so many times. We had a tape. We taped it off of HBO, and then I watched it whenever it was on. And then, obviously, Redford's other roles, even some of his later work, like in the MCU. It's just, it's really unfortunate. But we can always revisit these classic films and these wonderful performers. And I've argued, I even did a podcast on this. If I'm asked, out of context, somebody just randomly says, listen, with your alleged knowledge of movies, the idiot savant level stuff that you've memorized, if you had to give me, let's say, 5 of the most underrated performances in the history of cinema where you think the actor or actress just knocked it out of the park and didn't get as much acclaim as they should have, the first person I'm going to say is Ben Cross for Chariots of Fire. That is one of the great underrated performances I've ever seen. And I feel like, I mean, where was his Best Actor nomination? I love what Ian Charleson does, but his character doesn't have the same movement. Harold Abrahams actually has an arc that I don't think that Eric Liddell does. And that's kind of the point, that Eric Liddell will not move off his position, and that's what makes him special. But it's the slight turn to Harold Abrahams and the way that Ben Cross has some just epic line readings. It might be the most underrated performance, certainly the most underrated performance I've ever seen. But to give you a couple of other ones, John Goodman in a movie most of you have not seen, a 1993 movie called Matinee. That is another hugely underrated, and for me, the best performance of Goodman's career. He wasn't going to get an Oscar nomination. 1993 is the single greatest year Hollywood ever had, as far as I'm concerned. Lou Diamond Phillips in La Bamba. He could have easily been Oscar nominated for that. So those are 3. I don't want to just sit here and try to name more names. I said 5, but I'll give you 3. But it's what I've been thinking about today. The people who were lost, who have passed, and man, my 2 favorite sports movies. I know a lot of people put Hoosiers up there, and certainly Rudy, and Chariots of Fire and The Natural. It's 1 and 2, and then everything else from 3 through 10 is significantly behind. Like they're on the exalted level. It's almost a 1 and 1A. That's how much I love both of those movies. But that's what I was thinking about. Brad Davis passed at 40 or 41. Ian Charleson at 40. Ben Cross at 72. 3 of the gentlemen from Chariots of Fire. And Robert Redford made it to 89. And it seems that until the last couple of months of his life, he was still in really good health. So that's kind of all I wanted to say today. And I'm not going to do a conventional wrap up. I probably shouldn't have done the typical opening if I was going to talk about this sort of heavy stuff again. But I hope you've enjoyed this nevertheless, especially if you haven't seen either Chariots of Fire or The Natural. But I will be back very, very soon, hopefully with a more upbeat and joyful episode. Peace.